Hi, class. So we are back. I got cut off on our previous lecture, so I want to go ahead and keep on going. So when I left you, we were talking about kind of what causes us to develop. And so I left you on the slide where we talked about maturation and then we talked about learning. And the last piece here is related to that maintenance and regulation. And I was talking to you about the formation of neural connections, particularly when we're thinking about language acquisition. So if I've been exposed to another language and I am continually talking in this secondary language, I'm going to maintain those neural connections. They're not going to prune off. Instead, they will be continued to further be strengthened so that I can that pairing between this new language is going to be strengthened. And so in order for us to think about development, we also have to have this maintenance. So we can't just use it and lose it. We have to constantly be engaging in the behavior. So if I'm constantly engaging in my secondary language, I'm going to continue that connection, and I'll be more likely to be able to recall that language, etc., when I get into later life. So this brings us to what the goals of a developmental psychologist may be. Now, when we think about what we would like to do as developmental psychologists, the first and what would appear to be the most obvious is to describe development. So here it's this idea of observing behavior of an individual and this behavior that's occurring at different ages. More specifically, the idea here is to see how human beings are changing over time. So by noting a developmental outcome at age 5 and then taking a look at that progress at 10, 15, 20, 40, so on and so forth, I can actually see how we are growing and how we are changing on that dimension. Within this, we need to, though, remember that there are two different types of development. The first is normative development, and this is the typical pattern of development that would be common to most people. Think about milestones here. If you have ever taken a kid in to the pediatrician at their regularly scheduled appointments, they'll have a series of questions that they ask you. And very often, these are related to the child's developmental milestones. Is the child sitting unassisted? Is the child able to hold an object and pull themselves up? Is the child able to babble? These are all milestones. And we want to make sure that children are reaching them, right? And so, for example, my cousin, her kid wasn't really talking. And at first, the doctor said, okay, yeah, don't worry about this. And then as he progressed and he got older and older and it started falling outside of this range that we assume that's normal for that language acquisition, then it became a cause for concern. And at this point, one of the things that was noted was that my cousin's kid didn't really have to talk for himself. In fact, he would point to things and then somebody would say, oh, you want a cookie? Okay, here's a cookie. And so in this regard, he never actually had to ask for that cookie. He could just point to it and the object was labeled for him. Now, idiographic development is individual differences in the rate or direction of development. So let's go back to our example of talking. So my brother actually learned how to talk very quickly. We might ask, why is that? Well, he's actually younger. I'm older. If you don't know me, I talk a lot. And so I used to talk to him all the time. And so he was exposed to language in an even greater capacity than I was. And so it's not surprising then that he's picking this up at maybe a different rate than other children, right? Because of the exposure that he has. So when we're thinking about development or kind of that goals of developmental psychologists, we also want to think about explaining development. So this is just going beyond just facts. So when we think about, I kind of want to take you back to sort of my research area. And as I talk to you all about, I'm very interested in bullying or peer victimization. And so originally, we were kind of noting that kids who were reporting this high level of bullying, that they were not really going, they'd say, I don't want to go to school, I don't want to go to school, I don't want to go to school. And so a lot of individuals just brush this off. Well, of course, the kid doesn't want to go to school if they're being bullied. But we wanted to look at this in a little bit greater detail. And so could there be another reason why kids who are being bullied don't want to go to school? And what we ended up finding was that many of these children were being stressed out to the extent that it was actually influencing their physical health. So these kids were complaining of stomach aches and sore throats, and it was assumed that children were just faking it because they didn't want to go to school. But in fact, many of the research studies that we've done since that time have not only shown that that's incorrect, but have actually shown that the stress of being bullied actually mimics physical stress. And so the psychological stress of being bullied actually produces some of the same negative health outcomes that we would see with a person who's experiencing, for example, a major life stressor. And so we need to kind of go back. We're going back, reanalyzing those facts. And that's part of that developmental psychology. So, things like, well, all right, these two people experience the same thing. Why did person A turn out completely different from person B? And so all of this is that idea of kind of explaining that development. Developmental psychologists are also seeking to optimize development as well. So this is kind of applying what we know or what we're learning and helping aid in positive development. So, for example, we're going to be talking about this with eyesight, but what we actually find is that infants can only really see kind of sharp contrast, so black, white, and red. And so when children are first born, they really can't see anything else. And because of that understanding, we can now go to stores and see developmental toys that do have these shapes that are just black and white and red. And this is taking that research and then practically applying it to provide access to toys or books or whatever it is that would help aid that child in being able to see and to attune to things. And we'll talk about how that then might relate to the bond that a parent has with a child as they're talking through and looking at these at these books or at these mobiles or whatever it is. So really aiding in that positive development. So here's another really big thing I want us to kind of think about. So in terms of our development, there are a lot of different processes that are coming together. So we've got biological, cognitive, and socio-emotional processes that are all working together. Each of these things can be studied simply on their own. But when we think about development, it is the combination of these different processes together. In fact, we talk about this as the biopsychosocial model of development. This idea that everything in our development is a combination of biological influences, cognitive influences, and socio-emotional influences. And all of these three things together influence our development. So all of these processes are actually intertwined. And in fact, your book gives a really great example of this. Your book talks about a child that's smiling and thinking about smiling in response to maybe a parent touching that child. So just caressing that child ever so slightly. The response then that the child has to that touch is dependent on all of these different processes. So on the biological process, so the physical nature of the touch and the responsiveness to it, cognitively, right, the ability to understand what the intention of that brief small touch means. The socio-emotional process, so the act of smiling reflects a positive emotion and feeling and helps to then connect the child with the caregiver and increases that bond. So while we can look at simply just a baby smiling, the response then that the child has from that really is a combination of all three of these factors. So when we're thinking about development, we have many different periods that are sort of split up in our life, right? So while most individuals might think about development as only starting when we're born, we really can think about prenatally what is taking place. And this is going to be important as well. So just kind of take a look at this and recognize that many of the things that we're talking about, while they will occur during the lifespan, we do have concentrated periods of development that we can spend more time studying and really getting deep into. We have many different developmental issues that are discussed in this chapter. Three of the major ones that you probably have been exposed to even in intro to psychology is this issue between nature and nurture, our development looking at stability versus change, and then our development as being continuous or discontinuous. So let's kind of take a little bit of a deeper look into this. So nature and nurture is the debate in which our development is occurring as a result of our biological predisposition, so related more to our heredity, or to the nurture, our environment, and the influence that our environment has on our development. So I will spare you the huge debate that has taken place for many, many years and leave you with what we know currently, which is that all development is now thought to be a combination of both biological factors and environmental ones. For any of you who've taken abnormal psychology, we think about any mental health issue, it is a combination of genetics and environment. And one of the best quotes I've ever heard describe this is that genetics loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger when we're talking about mental health. So what this means is that as an individual, you may have a predisposition to schizophrenia. Maybe there's a family history of schizophrenia. But just because there's the genetic predisposition, if you do not have this environmental stressor that occurs in your life, you may never actually see that happening. And so there is a strong relationship between both our biological predisposition as well as our environment that influences who we are. Another well-studied kind of basic theory of development is this debate of activity versus passivity, and whether or not children are actively involved in their development or whether or not they're just sort of lumps that kind of sit there and society is putting their stamp on them. Again, sort of as a Cliff's Notes to this, we think about development as actually probably having more of this reciprocal determinism, meaning that the environment, right, or society is putting their influence on children, but children are also engaging in their environments and kind of pushing back. So we kind of have this role of back and forth between what we are showing and how we're interacting with children, and then also how children then are interacting with us. We can also think about whether our development happens continuously over time or sort of discontinuous, meaning that it just abruptly seems to change and happen. So we can take, for example, walking, right? So it may look as though a child is crawling one day and then all of a sudden they're walking, right? And so this might seem as though the development of walking is discontinuous. However, if you're around the child often, what you're probably noticing is that it takes there's a lot of different steps that are happening in between. So first the child is crawling, then maybe the child is pulling up on an object, and then maybe the child is cruising, so they're using that object to help them move around. And then only after that are they letting go and kind of standing in place. And then they may be walking. And so there's actually sort of perhaps maybe this continuous development that's taking place when we look at, for example, walking. Okay, so I'm going to end us here for this particular section, and then I'm going to start us up on a different video here shortly where we'll be talking about the different theories of development.